was one of those nights again, the kind where the world outside goes quiet but inside everything feels too loud. Keanu sat on the back porch of his home in Los Angeles, wrapped in an old hoodie, knees pulled up like he was trying to hold himself together. The city lights shimmered in the distance, soft and far away, like stars that didn't quite belong to him. He wasn't looking at them, though. His eyes were fixed on the empty space beside him, the spot where someone should have been. But no one was. He didn't cry, not yet. He never cried right away. It always came later, when the silence got too heavy, when the memories stopped being gentle and started pressing down on his chest like a weight he couldn't lift. Tonight it was his daughter's laugh he heard in his head. Not the real one, because she never got the chance to laugh out loud, but the one he imagined for her. Soft, curious, full of wonder. Ava, just a name now, but once she was everything. A tiny heartbeat on a screen, a pair of eyes that blinked open for only a few precious seconds before closing forever. He still kept the hospital bracelet in his wallet. Not because he needed a reminder, he could never forget, but because holding on to something, anything, made the absence feel a little less total. Then there was Jennifer. Her voice used to fill rooms like music. She'd walk in and suddenly everything felt lighter. Even on his worst days, she knew how to make him smile with just a look. But the car crash took her in an instant, just like that, gone. No warning, no last words, no chance to say I love you one more time. He remembered standing in the rain outside the hospital, numb, watching strangers move in slow motion while his whole world collapsed inside him. People kept telling him time would heal. But time didn't heal, it just stretched the pain out, made it quieter, not smaller. And River was his friend, his brother in every way that mattered. They'd shared dreams over cheap coffee, talked about changing the world through movies, about being kind when no one was watching. That night outside the Viper room, River had been laughing 1 minute, then gasping the next. Keanu held him as his body went still, whispering, "Stay with me, man, stay with me," over and over, like if he said it enough times it might come true, but it didn't. And the guilt, that he couldn't save him, that he wasn't faster, stronger, better, still lived in his bones. Most people saw Keanu as this calm, almost otherworldly figure, the guy who gave up his seat on the subway, who tipped generously, who never yelled at paparazzi. They called him the nicest man in Hollywood, like it was a title he'd earned. But what they didn't see was the man who sat alone at 3 a.m., staring at old photos, wondering why the universe kept taking the people who made life feel worth living. Why did love always come with this price tag? Why did the deeper you cared, the harder it hurt when they were gone? He wasn't angry at God, not exactly. But he was tired. Tired of showing up to premieres with a smile while his heart felt like it was wrapped in barbed wire. Tired of pretending he was okay when inside, he was still that scared kid who lost his dad before he even understood what a father was supposed to be. His mom had done her best, working double shifts, moving countries, fighting illness. But even she couldn't protect him from grief. And now, decades later, he was still learning how to carry it. The night air grew cooler. A neighbor's dog barked in the distance. Somewhere a car drove by with its windows down, music spilling out like laughter. Normal life kept going. That was the strangest part. How the world didn't stop when your heart did. People fell in love, got coffee, argued about traffic, posted selfies. While you were still stuck in the moment, your loved one took their last breath. It felt unfair, cruel even. Keanu leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped like he was praying, but he didn't know how to pray anymore. Not the way he used to as a kid, when faith felt simple and safe. Now it felt messy, complicated, full of questions with no answers. He'd read books, talked to priests, sat in churches just to feel close to something bigger than himself. But nothing filled the hole. Then, almost without thinking, the words slipped out. Soft, raw, barely more than a whisper. Jesus. Why do we lose the people we love? He didn't expect an answer. He wasn't even sure he believed someone was listening. But in that moment, it was the only question that mattered. Not how or when, but why. Why does love have to end in goodbye? Why do we get these beautiful, fragile connections only to have them ripped away? If love is the greatest thing we have, why does it hurt so much to lose it? He waited. The crickets kept chirping. The wind rustled the leaves. No voice came from the sky. No lightning. No sudden peace. Just silence, and yet something shifted. Not outside, but inside. Like he'd finally named the ache, given it a shape. and in doing so made it real enough to face. He stayed on the porch for a long time after that. Not hoping for a miracle, not expecting a sign, just sitting with the question, letting it breathe. Because sometimes asking is the bravest thing you can do, especially when you're not sure anyone's listening. And maybe, just maybe, that's where healing begins, not with answers, but with the courage to say out loud, "This hurts. I don't understand. Help me." Keanu didn't have any of that figured out yet, but for the first time in a while he didn't feel completely alone in the dark. And that was enough for now. A few mornings later, Keanu found himself walking through Griffith Park before the sun had fully risen. He did this often, early walks when the city was still half asleep, when the air felt clean and the world hadn't yet filled with noise. He didn't go for exercise or to clear his head exactly. It was more like he was searching for something he couldn't name. Maybe peace, maybe proof that he was still here, still breathing, even when it didn't always feel like it. The path was familiar, the same one he'd walked for years, past the old oak trees, over the small wooden bridge that creaked underfoot, up toward the quiet hillside where you could see the whole city spread out below like a map of someone else's life. Dew clung to the grass and his shoes got damp, but he didn't mind. There was something honest about the cold, about feeling the earth under your feet when everything else felt uncertain. He'd been thinking a lot about that question he'd whispered into the night. Why do we lose the people we love? It played in his mind like a song he couldn't turn off. He hadn't expected an answer, not really. But now, days later, it was all he could think about. He kept replaying the faces of the people he'd lost, not with anger this time, but with a strange kind of tenderness, like he was seeing them through a different lens. As he reached the top of the hill, the sky began to lighten, soft pinks and oranges bleeding into the gray. He stopped and just stood there, hands in his pockets, watching. The wind, which had been rustling the leaves steadily, suddenly stilled. The birds that had been chirping fell quiet. Even the distant hum of traffic seemed to fade. For a few seconds, it was as if the whole world held its breath. And in that stillness, something happened. Not loud, not dramatic, but deep. It wasn't a voice from the clouds or a vision in the sky. It was more like a thought that didn't feel like his own. Clear, gentle, certain. Because love is the point. He blinked, looked around. No one was there. Just him, the trees, the quiet dawn. But the words stayed with him, warm and steady in his chest, like a hand resting on his shoulder. At first, he didn't understand. It sounded too simple, almost naive. How could losing someone be the point? That didn't make sense. Loss felt like a mistake, a cruel twist, a wound that never fully closed. He'd spent years trying to outrun it, distract himself from it, pretend it wasn't there. And now this quiet answer felt like it was asking him to stop fighting. He walked back down the hill slowly, turning the words over in his mind like a smooth stone. Because love is the point. What did that even mean? Was it saying that pain was worth it? That heartbreak was part of the deal? He thought about Ava again. Not just her absence, but the love he'd felt the moment he knew she was coming. That wild, overwhelming rush of hope and fear and joy all tangled together. He'd never loved like that before. And even though she was only with him for such a short time, that love hadn't disappeared. It had changed him, made him softer, more aware of how precious every single moment really is. Then he thought about Jennifer, how she'd believed in him when he doubted himself, how she laughed at his dumb jokes, how she'd hold his hand during thunderstorms because she knew he didn't like the noise. Losing her had shattered him. But the love they shared? That hadn't vanished. It lived on in the way he treated people now, in the patience he tried to show, in the way he listened instead of just waiting to speak. And River. River taught him that friendship could be sacred, that showing up for someone, really showing up, was one of the bravest things you could do. Even now, years later, Keanu carried that lesson with him. He remembered how River would stop to talk to the janitor on set, how he'd give his coat to someone shivering on the street. That kind of love didn't die. It multiplied. By the time he got back to his car, the city was fully awake. Cars honked. People hurried to work. Coffee shops buzzed with chatter. But inside, Keanu felt different. Not fixed, never that, but shifted. Like he'd been looking at a puzzle from the wrong angle, and now a piece had finally clicked into place. Still, it wasn't easy to accept. That night, he sat on his couch with a cup of tea going cold in his hands, wrestling with the idea. If love is the point, then maybe loss isn't the enemy. Maybe it's just the price of admission. You don't get to love deeply without risking deep pain, and maybe that's okay. Maybe that's how you know it was real. He remembered something his mother once told him when he was a boy after his dog passed away. She'd held him close and said, "The love doesn't go away, sweetheart. It just changes shape." At the time, he hadn't understood, but now, decades later, those words made sense. Love doesn't disappear when someone dies. It becomes memory. It becomes action. It becomes the way you treat strangers, the way you hold your grief gently instead of burying it. The next day, he drove to the cemetery where his daughter was buried. He didn't go often, not because he didn't want to, but because it hurt too much. But this time he didn't bring flowers or kneel in silence. He just sat on the grass nearby and talked to her. Told her about the sunrise, about the quiet morning, about the strange peace he'd felt. He didn't cry. Not because he wasn't sad, but because he finally understood. She was still part of his story. Not as a wound, but as a thread woven into who he'd become. Later that week, he called Jennifer's mom. Not for any big reason. Just to hear her voice, to say Jennifer's name out loud, to remind her that she wasn't forgotten. They talked for over an hour, sharing stories, laughing through tears. And when they hung up, Keanu felt lighter, like he'd honored something sacred. He started noticing things he used to miss, the way a stranger smiled at him on the street, the kindness of a barista who remembered his order, the quiet strength in people who carried their own invisible grief. He realized that everyone was walking around with some kind of loss. And maybe that's what connected them all, not their pain, but the love that came before it. The answer hadn't fixed everything. He still missed them. He still woke up some nights reaching for a hand that wasn't there. But now, instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" he found himself wondering, "What did this love teach me?" And slowly, quietly, he began to live like someone who understood that love, even when it ends in goodbye, is never wasted. It's the reason we're here. The reason we keep going. The reason we try to be kind even on the hardest days. Because love isn't just a feeling. It's a choice, a legacy, a light that doesn't go out even in the darkest night. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. It didn't hit him all at once. Not like a thunderclap or a movie moment where everything suddenly makes sense. It crept in slowly like fog rolling over the hills. Quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore. The words from that morning in the park kept echoing in his mind. Because love is the point. At first, they'd felt comforting, almost peaceful. But the more he sat with them, the heavier they became. Because if love really was the point, then every loss he'd carried wasn't just pain. It was proof. Proof that he'd loved deeply, fully, without holding back. And that truth? It didn't bring relief. It broke him. One evening, after a long day on set, smiling for cameras, hitting his marks, saying lines that felt hollow compared to what was churning inside, he came home and didn't even take off his shoes. He just stood in the middle of his living room, staring at the wall like it might give him an answer. But the silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. He sank to the floor, back against the couch, and for the first time in years he let go. The tears came fast and hard, not neat or quiet, but messy and raw, great, heaving sobs that shook his whole body. He cried for Ava, for the life she never got to live, for the lullabies he never got to sing, for the way her tiny fingers had curled around his thumb for just a few seconds before letting go forever. He cried for Jennifer, for the future they'd planned, the inside jokes no one else would ever understand, the way she used to hum while making coffee in the morning. He cried for River, for the dreams they'd shared, the late-night talks about truth and art and how to stay human in a world that rewards cruelty. He cried for his mother, who fought so hard for so long, who taught him kindness even when life gave her every reason to be bitter. And he cried for himself, for the boy who learned too early that people leave, that love doesn't always protect you, that sometimes, no matter how much you care, it's not enough to keep someone here. He didn't try to stop it. No more pretending. No more swallowing it down until it turned into something hard and sharp inside his chest. This wasn't weakness. This was surrender. And in that surrender, something shifted. Because the realization wasn't just that love leads to loss. It was that loss reveals the depth of love. You don't grieve what you didn't cherish. You don't ache for what didn't matter. Every tear was a testament this person mattered. This love was real. He sat on that floor for hours. The sun went down. Streetlights flickered on outside. His phone buzzed with messages. Work stuff, a friend checking in, but he didn't move. He just let the grief wash over him, not as an enemy, but as an old companion he'd been avoiding for too long. And in the quiet aftermath, a strange clarity came. He thought about all the times he'd tried to outrun his pain, throwing himself into work, traveling constantly, staying busy so he wouldn't have to feel. He'd treated grief like a flaw, something to fix or hide. But what if it wasn't? What if it was just love with nowhere to go? That's when it hit him. Jesus hadn't given him an explanation. He'd given him an invitation to stop seeing his sorrow as a burden and start seeing it as a bridge to others who were hurting, a bridge to deeper compassion, a bridge back to his own humanity. He remembered the fan who once stopped him on the street, eyes red from crying, and whispered, "My son passed last week. You're the only one I thought might understand." He'd hugged her then, not as a movie star, but as someone who knew what it felt like to have your heart split open. He hadn't said much, just held her hand and said, "I'm so sorry. You're not alone." At the time, he'd thought he was offering comfort. Now he realized she'd given him something too. She'd reminded him that his pain could be useful, that it could connect him to others in ways success or fame never could. He got up slowly, legs stiff, face swollen. He washed his face, made a cup of tea, and sat by the window. The city glittered below, millions of lives unfolding, some joyful, some broken, most somewhere in between. And for the first time, he didn't feel separate from it all. He felt part of it, human, flawed, tender. He started thinking about the things he did without fanfare, the donations to children's hospitals, the quiet support for families going through hard times, the way he always asked the crew on set how their kids were doing. He'd never seen those acts as anything special, just what you do when you know how much a little kindness can mean. But now he saw the thread connecting them all: love. Not the grand, dramatic kind, but the everyday, stubborn kind that shows up even when it hurts. He realized he'd been living the answer without knowing it. Every time he chose patience over anger, presence over distraction, generosity over comfort, he was honoring the people he'd lost. Not by clinging to the past, but by letting their love move through him into the world. That night, he didn't sleep much. But it wasn't because of nightmares or restlessness. It was because his heart felt wide open, scared, yes, but also strangely full, like he'd finally stopped fighting the current and let it carry him. The next morning, he went to the grocery store, not for anything special, just milk and bread. An elderly man struggled to reach a box of cereal on a high shelf. Without thinking, Keanu stepped over and handed it to him. The man smiled, eyes crinkling at the corners. "Bless you, son." And in that simple exchange, Keanu felt it again, that quiet hum of connection, of shared humanity. He walked out into the sunlight, bag in hand, and took a deep breath. The air smelled like rain and pavement and possibility. He still missed them. He always would. But the missing didn't have to be a prison. It could be a compass, because love doesn't end when someone dies. It changes direction. It flows outward. It becomes the way you treat the cashier, the stranger on the bus, the kid who looks lost in the airport. It becomes your reason to be gentle in a world that often isn't. And in that broken open place where grief and grace meet, he finally understood. The pain wasn't the opposite of love. It was love's echo, and echoes, no matter how faint, never truly disappear. He didn't wake up one morning and suddenly become a different person. Healing doesn't work like that. It's not a switch you flip. It's more like planting a seed in rocky soil and watering it every day, even when you don't see anything growing. But something had changed inside him. The grief was still there, like an old friend who'd moved in and wasn't going anywhere. But now, instead of hiding from it, he let it walk beside him. And in doing so, he started living differently. Not perfectly, but with more intention, more heart. It began in small ways. On set, between takes, he'd notice a crew member looking tired or stressed. Instead of just saying, "Hey, you okay?" and walking away, he'd stop. Really stop, ask how their week was going. Listen to the answer. Sometimes that meant standing in the rain for 10 extra minutes just to hear about someone's kid's soccer game or their mom's surgery. People would look surprised at first, like they couldn't believe someone with his name on the call sheet actually cared. But he did. Because he knew now, everyone is carrying something heavy. And sometimes just being seen is enough to make the weight feel lighter. He also started giving more, not because he had to, but because it felt like the right thing to do. Not the flashy kind of giving that makes headlines, but the quiet kind. He'd hear about a family struggling with medical bills and send help without leaving a name. He'd visit hospitals not for photo ops, but to sit with kids who were scared or in pain, just holding their hand while they watched cartoons. He never talked about it, not because he was trying to be humble, but because it didn't feel like charity to him. It felt like connection, like love in action. One afternoon, he got a call from a non-profit that supported single parents. They'd reached out months ago, and he'd quietly started funding part of their program: rent assistance, childcare, counseling. The woman on the line was crying as she thanked him. "You have no idea what this means," she said. "Some of these families were one missed paycheck away from losing everything." He just listened, his throat tight. He thought about his own mother, how hard she'd worked, how many times she must have lain awake wondering how she'd make it through the week. Helping others felt like honoring her, too. But the biggest shift wasn't in what he did. It was in how he saw the world. Before, loss had made him feel alone, like he was the only one walking around with this invisible weight. Now he saw grief everywhere, in the tired eyes of a bus driver, in the way a woman clutched her wedding ring while ordering coffee, in the silence between two friends who'd clearly lost someone they both loved. And instead of turning away, he leaned in, not with pity but with presence, because he finally understood we're all broken in some way. And the most human thing we can do is say, "Me too." He started saying yes more, to small things, to ordinary moments. He'd sit on a park bench and talk to whoever sat down beside him. He'd let strangers take photos if they asked nicely. He'd sign autographs not as a chore but as a chance to share a real smile. Once a young man approached him, trembling, and said, "My sister died last month. She loved your movies. They got her through chemo." Keanu didn't offer empty words like, "She's in a better place." He just looked the man in the eyes and said, "Tell me about her." And for 10 minutes they stood there on the sidewalk, talking about her laugh, her favorite song, how she always wore mismatched socks. When they parted, the man hugged him, tight, desperate, and whispered, "Thank you for remembering her." That moment stayed with him longer than any premiere or award. He also began to forgive himself for not being able to save River, for not holding Ava longer, for the times he'd been too busy or distracted to really be there for the people he loved. He realized now that love isn't about perfection. It's about showing up even when you're scared, even when you don't have the right words. And he had shown up. Over and over. That had to count for something. At night, he still thought about the question he'd asked in the dark. But now, instead of waiting for an answer from the sky, he found it in the faces of the people he met. In the nurse who worked double shifts to support her family. In the teenager who volunteered at an animal shelter after losing his best friend. In the old man who played piano in the subway just to bring a little beauty into someone's day. Love wasn't some distant ideal. It was alive right here in the messy, ordinary acts of kindness people offered each other every single day. And Jesus? He didn't need to hear a voice anymore. He felt the presence in the quiet moments, in the stillness of dawn, in the warmth of a shared silence, in the way his heart softened when he chose compassion over convenience. He realized now that faith wasn't about having all the answers. It was about trusting that love matters, even when it hurts, even when it ends, even when it leaves you shattered on the floor. So he kept going. Not as a hero, not as a saint, just as a man trying to live by what he'd learned. He made mistakes. Some days the grief still knocked him sideways, but he didn't run from it anymore. He let it teach him, let it shape him, let it remind him that every person he met was fighting a battle he couldn't see, and that a little kindness could be a lifeline. Because in the end, that's what love is. Showing up, staying present, choosing to care even when it's hard. And that, he now knew, was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The memorial was small, just a handful of people gathered under a canopy of oak trees in a quiet corner of the cemetery. No cameras, no speeches, just flowers, soft voices, and the kind of silence that only comes when hearts are heavy. Keanu stood near the back, not because he wanted to hide, but because he didn't want to take up space that belonged to the family. He'd come because he'd been asked. Not as a celebrity, but as someone who understood loss. The young fan had been only 16, bright, full of dreams, fighting leukemia for 2 long years before it finally took her. Her parents had written him a letter months ago, just to say how much his movies had meant to her during treatment. She'd watched them over and over, they said, especially when the pain was bad. They didn't ask for anything, just thanked him for being a light in her dark days. He'd written back right away, sent a note, a few signed photos, and when she passed, they invited him to say goodbye. He didn't speak during the service. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, watching the way her mother clutched a worn stuffed rabbit, the one the girl had kept on her hospital bed. The father kept glancing at the sky like he was searching for a sign, for some kind of proof she was still with them. Keanu knew that look. He'd worn it himself. Afterward, as people began to drift away, the mother walked over to him. Her eyes were red but dry now, like she'd cried all she could. She didn't say much at first, just looked at him. Really looked like she was trying to see past the famous face to the person underneath. Then she reached out and took his hand. "You came," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted to," he replied. She nodded, squeezing his hand tighter. "Most people send flowers and disappear, but you made her feel seen. And today you made me feel less alone." Those words hit him harder than any applause ever had. Because that was it, wasn't it? That was the whole point. Not fame, not success, not even answers to the big questions. Just this, showing up. Being there. Letting someone know they're not invisible in their pain. He stayed a while longer, talking quietly with the family, listening more than speaking. He didn't offer advice. Didn't say she's in a better place or everything happens for a reason. He just let them talk about her laugh, her stubbornness, how she'd argue with nurses about ice cream, how she wanted to be a marine biologist even though she'd never seen the ocean, and in those stories she was alive again. Not gone, just changed. Driving home, the city lights blurred through the windshield, not from rain but from tears he didn't bother to wipe away. But this time the tears didn't feel like breaking. They felt like honoring, like love moving through him, not stopping. Over the years he'd stopped waiting for the pain to go away. He'd learned to carry it like a compass. It pointed him toward kindness, toward patience, toward the quiet moments that most people rushed past. He still got recognized on the street, still got asked for selfies, still lived a life most would call extraordinary. But what mattered to him now were the ordinary things. The barista who remembered how he took his coffee, the old man who waved from his porch every morning, the kid who shyly handed him a drawing after a screening. He'd realized something important. Grief doesn't shrink, but your heart grows around it. And in that space, you find room for more love, more connection, more meaning than you ever thought possible. He started visiting schools sometimes, not to talk about movies, but about loss, about how it's okay to not be okay, about how asking for help is a sign of strength, not weakness. Kids would raise their hands and share stories about grandparents, siblings, pets they'd lost. And he'd listen, really listen, because he knew what it felt like to have no one understand. He'd tell them, "Your love didn't die with them. It's still here, use it. Let it make you kind." He also kept giving quietly, consistently. He funded programs for grieving families, supported hospice care, helped build spaces where kids could talk about death without fear. Not because he thought it would fix anything, but because he knew how much it would have meant to him, years ago, to feel less alone. One evening, while walking through a park near his home, he saw a young couple sitting on a bench holding each other tightly, both crying. He didn't interrupt, just walked past slowly, giving them space. But as he passed, the woman looked up and their eyes met for just a second. In that glance he saw it, the same raw ache he'd carried for so long. And without thinking, he gave a small nod. Not pity, not advice, just acknowledgement. "I see you." "I know," she nodded back. And in that tiny exchange, something passed between them, unspoken but real. A thread of shared humanity. That's what he'd come to understand. We're all connected by our wounds, but even more by our willingness to hold each other through them. He never got the grand answer he'd hoped for that night on the porch. No lightning, no voice from the sky, no sudden miracle that made the pain vanish. But he got something deeper. He got the understanding that love isn't measured in how long it lasts, but in how deeply it changes us. And every person he'd lost had changed him for the better. They'd taught him to be softer, more present, more human. Now when he missed them, he didn't just sit in the dark. He went out into the world and loved on their behalf. He held doors. He listened. He remembered names. He showed up, even when it was hard, even when it hurt. because that's what love does. It echoes, it ripples. It lives on in the way we treat strangers, in the quiet acts of courage we choose every day, in the space we make for others' grief, and sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet and the memories come calling, he doesn't fight them. He welcomes them. He lights a candle, says their names out loud, and whispers, "Thank you for loving me. I'm still learning how to love like you did." He knows now that he'll never stop missing them. But he also knows this: they're not really gone. They're in every kind word he offers, every tear he shares with a stranger, every time he chooses compassion over comfort. And in that truth, he's found something close to peace. Not the kind that erases pain, but the kind that makes it meaningful. Because love, even when it ends in goodbye, never truly ends. It just finds new ways to live. And that more than anything is enough.